Good afternoon, and thank you for being here very, very much. This is really a wonderful experience to see all of these familiar faces and some that aren't, and have a chance to say hello. We are, as you have heard, celebrating the American West Center at 50, and my task this afternoon is to shepherd us through a panel that will be talking about various aspects of the history of the American West Center over those 50 years. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Smoke and his wonderful staff for their hard work in putting this program together. This is not an easy thing to do. It has multiple problems, and they occur about every 50 seconds when you're running these things, and it's off. The conference is off to a very good start. I'd also like to thank Dr. Richard White for his wonderful presentation as a keynote. I've already had several people say to me, now I understand what public history is, so thank you. So I'm Greg Thompson. I'm the Associate Dean, J. Willard Marriott Library. I run special collections, or it runs me, depending on what day you're on and how things are going. And I've had the privilege of being associated with the American Center one way or another for most, but not all, of those 50 years. It's frightful to say that. I came to the center in 1967 in April, and I, like most of you, came that wasn't good enough.
We're oral history professionals here.
I am distracting you all. I apologize.
But now,
I'm not going to say all that again. I'll just say.
That was one of those every 50-second
Yeah. So, welcome to this afternoon's panel. I'm Greg Thompson. I'm the Associate Dean for Special Collections at the J. Willard Marriott Library, and it is truly an honor to be here and with you this afternoon. There are so many familiar faces. This crowd, as I see it, represents a major portion of the history of the center. As I was mentioning, I came to the center in 1967. I came because of Dr. Floyd A. O'Neill, like others have said already, and many will say. He plucked me off the streets of Durango, Colorado, and out of the halls of Fort Lewis College in Durango, and he called me up one day and he said, I think I got a job for you, Thompson. And I said, whoa, am I interested? 2 weeks later, I was living on his couch in Murray, and I was associated with the American West Center. It has been an extraordinary trip. I got to ride in the sidecar on a long motorcycle, American Indian motorcycle. It was a trip, and I hope to share just a little bit of that. But also my duties are to introduce our panel this afternoon, who will be talking about the history of the center. It's a wonderful panel. It is a panel that is highly distinguished and has achieved many, many great things from including their time in the American West Center as students and graduate students and on into their careers. I'm going to introduce people just a little different from the order that you see, and we will speak accordingly, except for I'm going to take the Master of Ceremony rights, and I will talk first. After that, we will hear from Richard Hart, E. Richard Hart. Richard, as you know, is a historian of the American West. He was associated with the American West Center at the University of Utah from 1969. I think Floyd thinks it's 1968. Richard and I aren't sure. So it could be 1968 to 1975. Afterwards, he became director of the Institute of the American West at Sun Valley, Idaho. He served as editor for a series of publications that came out of that tenure, and wonderful, wonderful publications, and he held the best dang conferences you could ever imagine. I've never been to one that quite equals what Richard put on over that period of time. In 1984, Richard helped to establish the Institute of North American West in Seattle, Washington, and he, in addition to directing centers, he has also served as an expert witness in a number of federal court cases. He will be talking a bit about that when he comes to the podium. As a matter of fact, he will be focusing on what was part of the major assignment when he was in the American West Center, and that was working with the Pueblo of Zuni. He has produced, edited Zuni in the Courts, published by the University of Kansas Press in 1995, and he authored Pedro Pino, Governor of the Zuni Pueblo, 1830 to 1875, published by Utah State University in 2003. Now, when I asked Richard, what should I say about him? He said, well, I'm Hart West Associates. My criminal record is short, and I do public history. So, indeed, he is president and CEO of Hart West Associates, and he will be talking about his experiences on the Pueblo of Zuni and their legal issues. Next, we'll ask Forrest Kutch to come to the podium, and Forrest will be speaking about his experiences, which were very unique and very early in the history of the center. Forrest, born and raised on the Uinta and Ouray Ute Reservation in northeastern Utah, attended public schools through the 9th grade, or until the 9th grade, when he then was enrolled and graduated from the Wasatch Academy in Mount Pleasant, Utah. He obtained a BA in Behavioral Sciences from Westminster College in Salt Lake City in 1973, and later attended graduate school at the University of Utah. Most importantly, he served as the educational director of the Ute Indian tribe from 1973 to 1988. I believe I have those dates correct for us. And then he became planner for the Wampanoag tribe of Gay Head in Massachusetts, and later as tribal administrator. Those were in the early part of the 1990s. In 1994, he was appointed as the Social Studies Department Director for the Wasatch Academy. Leaving that, he became Director of the State of Utah's Office of Indian Affairs in 1998, held that position for 13 years, and I must say to you, he was extraordinarily effective, and those of us who had the opportunity to work with him were much benefited by all that he did. He has moved back to the reservation and has held several positions with the tribe, and now he tells me he is retired. He will be talking about developing tribal histories, and particularly the history of the Ute, of which he has several publications. The third speaker will be, if I can catch up with myself here, a wonderful friend and colleague, Dr. Vicente Mayer Jr. Vince grew up in Utah in Salt Lake City. His parents were immigrants from Mexico in the 1920s. He understood the experiences for that community being from immigrant parents. And he entered the University of Utah, received a BA, left to serve with Peace Corps, which he did in Nigeria, and I believe it's correct, he met his wife there. He returned to the university after several employment stops and pursued both a master's and a PhD degree in history and Middle East studies, graduating in 1975. Almost immediately, he was grabbed by the Department of State and had a very successful career with the department and served in a number of locations throughout Latin America and Singapore and into Africa. I suspect he may talk a little bit about that, but his career with the State Department was spectacular, and Vince was instrumental in helping Floyd put together an initiative to take the study of the ethnic communities into Utah and help direct that towards what became one of the first curriculum studies program at the American West Center. Finally, not least, last, but the best, is Dr. Jennifer Robinson. Jen, as we all know her, Jenny, as we all know her, serves as the director for the Center of Public Policy and Administration at the University of Utah currently. That center, and through her guidance, they have a solid commitment to both scholarship and practice, and Dr. Robinson and the team of CPPA that work to ensure that research contributes to sound policymaking, implementation, and administration. Prior to being named as director, Dr. Robinson served as interim director for the CPPA, helping to navigate the office through a year of growth, challenge, and change. In previous roles, she too worked for the American West Center, along with being a research associate attached to the Utah House of Representatives. And as you might guess, with the roles that she's played in these areas, she is held in high regard. We know her as an individual who lent incredible talent and research assets to helping the American West Center in what was a very interesting proposal and focus during the late 1990s and through the 2000s and aughts. There, she focused, along with Director Dan McCool, on Indian voting rights, and has a number of publications I'm hoping she will mention to you, where she worked with both Susan Olson from the university's faculty and Dan. She's published several books. She has a national reputation in this area, and she will talk to us about how that work under the leadership of the center has helped to shape some major initiatives and projects. With that, let me just make a few comments about the very beginnings of the center. Oh my goodness. Will Bagley, for Christ's sakes. Let me get my notes. I'm sorry, Will. Actually, we're putting Will last, and I did that because he has a very special story to tell. Will, I'm just going to briefly do this off the top. Will, of course, is our independent historian. He is one of the best researchers we have in this state. He has published two major series of publications, one on the Mormons and the frontier, and the other, and that's almost complete. It has 18 volumes, Will? Kingdom in the West. And that's, I believe, in its last volume. It's a wonderful contribution. In addition to that, he has been writing a major multi-volume work on the Overland Trail and its history. 3 of those volumes are out, and he's working on the 4th. He also has just published what I think is a very significant book on South Pass. Will didn't actually have I suppose, a paying role with the American West Center, but he has been very close and instrumental in the work of the center, and he has worked very closely with Floyd O'Neill, who I know he considers his mentor. I'm pleased to say to you that Will serves on our Friends of the Marriott Library, and we are working together on a major publication that focuses on historian, independent writer David Bigler. So, Will, thank you. So the American West Center comes about in a major way because the Western historians, both professional and the interested folks who like American West history, got together in 1961 to see if they couldn't bring together an association. They did. It was formed. You've heard that history. I'm sure Greg Smoke is documenting that history currently through the oral histories that he's conducting. And in the first formal session at Santa Fe, it was decided by the group that indeed they wanted to have an association. They made plans to meet the year following in Denver, which they did. And in that meeting, they received a proposal from A.R. Mortensen and C. Gregory Crampton from the University of Utah to found and host a publication called The American West. That publication was received by the group and became their official first magazine of history, journal of history. It came to, of course, to the university, and it had to have a home. And so in part response to that, Mortensen, Crampton, and David E. Miller, the then chair of the department, founded the American West Center, located it in the annex where it lived for a good many years, and many of you have had your experiences there. The center formally was, at that time, under the direction of Crampton. It lasted for 8 issues, 2 volumes of the American West, when the quarterly, it was a quarterly, was moved to Palo Alto under the editorialship of Wallace Stegner. As that was happening, the university received notice that they were chosen as one of the 6 universities to participate in the Doris Duke American Indian Oral History program. The program was charged with attempting to research and document the history of American Indians from their own views, and Crampton was named to head that initiative. The center received word in, I believe, December of 1966, November, December, and immediately Crampton set about putting together a staff. He was bright enough to know that he had to get one of his graduate students, involved, and that was Floyd A. O'Neill. It took arm twisting. Floyd and I have had a lot of discussions about this, and Floyd was reticent to do this, but he was the natural individual to do it. He had grown up on the Uinta-Ouray Reservation. As Richard said to us earlier, he had experiences in rural Utah, and he was a damn good historian. They wore him down, and he became really the first hired employee after Crampton in the center. And it was his charge, and this is important, it was his charge to develop the field research for the Doris Duke American Indian Oral History Project. Floyd never, ever left the charge of developing field work and field research for the American West Center. To the time he retired, and even today, he's involved in it. That project lasted until 1972. It developed a total of 1,458 oral histories, about 25, not quite, but almost 2,500 hours of interview time. It was part of an initiative, what became 6 other universities that participated, spread from the University of Florida out to UCLA in California. And I would suggest to you, and there are several of us who worked on that project in this room here today, that the very beginning of why the center developed its expertise in the way it did starts with that initiative. Those were interesting days, and they were tough days in a lot of ways, and particularly if somebody of less talent than Floyd had been directing the field research, it would have failed point blank. It didn't. Following that, it's an interesting time because, as you remember, in the country we have the rise of ethnic studies and the interest in ethnic groups. That happened, amazingly enough, it happened at the University of Utah. And there developed a program within the administration run by Thomas Monson that called for, it was the effort to help the students get organized, get into school, and become involved. The university was bright enough to know it needed to get to Floyd O'Neill, and did so, and there developed a series of oral history projects that ran, well, in some ways they still run, but their immediate focus was from about 1972 into 75, 76. And it included all the major groups, both ethnic and labor immigrant groups in Utah. There were extraordinary people, I won't go through that, but there were extraordinary people who became involved, students, who developed about 450 interviews on the groups. That resulted in a series of publications that came out of the center. Those publications helped to lay the foundation, the third part of the foundation. You've got Doris Duke that involves the center in American Indians at the reservation level and in the urban area. You have the oral history program with the ethnics, and the publications begin to talk about that which the center was achieving. Well, what I suggest to you is these efforts teach the center, those of us in the center, how to become public historians at multiple levels. And it's that foundation upon which you see the center emerge through the 70s, 80s, 90s, the aughts, and into the teens. And you'll hear more about that as we go along. With that, I'd like to step aside, and we'll bring Forrest to the, Richard to the podium, and he'll talk a little bit about Zuni. Richard?
Thanks, Greg. I started working at the American West Center in either 1968 or 1969. It was the 60s, so my memories may be a little paisley. But I do believe that was the beginning of a movement. It was the Occupy the American West Center movement. Floyd set me out on either they were tasks or trials, I'm not sure. He started me, one of the first things he had me do was read the entire run of the Millennial Star and index it. This is pre-computer, you have to remember. And after I got done with that, I moved on to Harper's Weekly, which was an even greater task. And then I graduated eventually into Record Group 75, and a microfilm, we had microfilm. I had a microfilm reader, which must have been built in about 1948, in my office. And anyway, if any of you know what it's like to read microfilm 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, that was a real trial. Record Group 75 are the records of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He also set me on records of the Indian Claims Commission. And by the way, if you think about this, 1968 to the present, this is like something like 70% of my life has been associated with with Floyd and the American West Center. So Floyd convinced me I should give up my life of crime, which was relatively lucrative, and move on to history. And after I'd been there a year, or maybe it was 2 years, I had done a couple of little books for the Pueblo of Zuni. One was called Experiences and Descriptions, about a brief history of the tribe, and then I did a common Zuni vocabulary. I worked on these for the center, and they were given to the Zuni. They're still in use today, 40-something years later, in the schools at Zuni. When I go down there, I still see them in the schools. And I believe it was in 1970. I had a trip to Zuni with Greg Crampton. And I will tell you, I got a really good introduction into Gallup bars. I actually was in a bar with Dr. Crampton, and a fight broke out. And he calmly turned around and just put his feet up so that he could kick people away if they got too close, and kept telling me about the history of, igneous rocks in Zion or something. But I'd done some work on the Duke Oral History program at Zuni, and it was really remarkable at that time in the late 1960s, early 1970s. I was able to interview people in their 90s that remembered the first Americans, to the first American anthropologists at Zuni, Frank Hamilton Cushing and Matilda Cox Stevenson. And people were still alive that remembered them. And Zuni was a really amazing place. And Floyd said, the council has invited us down to talk about a proposed project. And I believe this was 1970, late 69 or 70. And so we drove down there, and the governor of Zuni, the head of the tribal council, it's called governor at Zuni, was a fellow by the name of Robert E. Lewis, very smart, capable person. And we sat in the council, and Governor Lewis said, we would like you to look at two questions. Did the Pueblo of Zuni have a valid claim against the United States? And if so, why didn't it file the claim under the Indian Claims Commission? So I'm going to digress just for a minute with some substance. From the very first, the Continental Congress, even before the the Constitution. The Continental Congress understood that Indians had rights to their land. Eventually, under the Constitution and under early laws like the Northwest Ordinance, they decided that Indians held Aboriginal title, which is a kind of use title, not recognized title, not real title, but that Aboriginal title, in order for white people, for non-Indians, to acquire a clear title to property, Aboriginal title first had to be extinguished. This was a really important point, and it was understood by Congress, every Congress in the 19th century. So there are two ways to extinguish Aboriginal title. One was by conquest, and the other was by treaty. By the early 20th century, tribes had started to figure out that under federal law, the United States had not properly taken their lands, that there had been unconscionable takings. And a good example is in California, for instance. In California, in the 1850s, a series of 13 treaties were made with tribes down the interior of the whole state. And the legislature of California didn't like that idea and went back to Washington and convinced the Senate not only not to ratify these treaties, but to seal them. And they were sealed away in the Senate archives until the early 20th century when somebody discovered them again. And that's one of the reasons when we see tribes in California seeking federal acknowledgement today, that's one of the reasons tribes down there didn't get acknowledged, because the United States didn't carry out the treaty obligations it had. So in the state, in Washington Territory, when the first governor, Isaac Stevens, is sent out to take over the state, his primary goal and his instructions from the Secretary of Interior are to extinguish Aboriginal title to all Indians' lands in the state, and also establish a railroad route so that non-Indians can come in and take those lands. So this is a really important point, and that by the early 20th century, tribes had begun to understand that lots and lots of their lands had been taken without adequate compensation or without any compensation. And they started, California tribes got together and sued the United States. And a number of other tribes began lawsuits. And finally, Congress decided we need to pass some kind of an act to get these under one tent and try and not have 1,000 different lawsuits. And the Indian Claims Commission Act was passed in 1946. It had and tribes were given 5 years to file a lawsuit against the United States. Every tribe in the United States was supposed to be informed. And at Zuni, on the day the 5-year statute ran, a letter was sent in saying, it's purportedly signed by the Zuni Tribal Council, saying they had no claim against the United States. So Governor Lewis asked Floyd, and I was there too, he asked Floyd if the center could take on a job to look at these two questions. Did the tribe have a claim? And if so, why didn't they file it before the statute ran out? And he thought he knew the answer. The whole tribe thought they knew the answer, but they were very smart and very careful not to tell us what they thought. They wanted an independent inquiry. Now, I had learned enough from Floyd at this point about working with tribes to know that, especially with a non-literate tribe, commitment, the idea of commitment, the idea of a verbal promise was really important. And that if I was going to commit myself to working on this project, this was not a 6-month project. I knew that the Indian Claims Commission cases often went on for decades, many decades, some of them. And I can remember sitting there in that council room with Floyd and thinking, okay, well, if I say I'll do this, this may last a long time. I really had no idea how long. I just got word from the Justice Department attorney that I needed to renew a contract with them over the Zuni water adjudication. And that's 2015, that's what we're looking at, 45 years. But the Floyd said yes, and I was hired to work on that case, and I worked on it for, I think, close to 2 years, and eventually produced a report with the catchy title, Preliminary Examination of Documents Relating to Zuni Lands 1846 to 1951. I never was great with titles. I should point out that another thing Floyd emphasized in dealing with history that would eventually be part of a lawsuit, we hoped, we thought, anticipated, was that primary sources rule. Secondary sources don't get you very far in court. You have to be able to look at primary sources. And even with primary sources, you have to be very careful in analyzing them and not you guessed it, stretching the facts like we know how it's coming, don't we? Like a rat's ass over a rain barrel. That's another of Floyd's aphorism. But that sticks with you, and Floyd was very careful to emphasize that you can't make something out of a document that isn't there. And I would just add something to what Richard was saying in his great address at lunch, and that is that history is messy, and there's always an anomalous document. It's just like a car wreck. 3 people can see the red car run through the stoplight and hit the white car, and one person sees the white car running through the stoplight, hitting the red car. I mean, there's always a document that just doesn't fit. And you're way better off to present it yourself than to let the other side present it. So we worked on this. I presented that report, I believe, in 1974, and Floyd said, now it's time for you to get out in the world and see if you can make a living. And it took until 1978, I believe it was former Utah Congressman Wayne Owens, who was able to lobby the jurisdictional bill through Congress in 1978 that allowed Zuni to eventually file suit against the United States. Eventually they filed 2 suits, one for lands taken without compensation or without adequate compensation, and the other for damage to trust lands as a result of actions and inactions of the United States. Now, all those cases came entirely as a result of Floyd's commitment to take on that project for Zuni in about 1970. And Floyd stayed committed to this project throughout its life. Under claims case, the way claims cases work is you first have to show the extent of land that was taken without payment or without adequate payment. And usually they bifurcate the cases. So that's one trial. And then there's a second trial to determine the value of the lands at the time they were taken. And unless you can show that the land that the tribe somehow held recognized title, then you get the value of the land at the time it was taken without any interest. So if the land was taken in 1846, the value of the land might be, I would argue, at a very minimum, $1.25 an acre. And that's one of the reasons why claims cases resulted in such relatively small judgments for tribes. We spent a lot of time talking with the attorney. Floyd, by the way, was also responsible for convincing Stephen Boyden to take the job as claims attorney for the tribe, and to convince the tribe to hire Steve. and that was a great burden on Steve over the years. The United States has two hats in a case like this. The Interior Department is the trustee for the tribe, and so if you have an indigent tribe, although Zuni didn't like that term, under the rules of the Interior Department, they were at the time indigent. They couldn't afford to pay for witnesses or for trial, and so the Interior Department had to loan them money sufficient to litigate the case, and that meant that the Interior Department, who was being sued by Zuni, had to pay the people who were suing them. And I can tell you that there were some less than happy feelings at the area office in Albuquerque towards those of us who are witnesses. The attorney, however, could have some of his expenses reimbursed, but no pay until the judgment was settled. So it was a great burden on Steve. I think it had something to do with breaking up the law firm. And eventually, let me just tell you a couple of stories about doing the work. This is before we get to the judgment. This is not only pre-computer, we're out in the field. We didn't have GPSs. There were GPSs, but they were very, very expensive. And we actually had to use maps and compasses to mark where we were. And I remember that since T.J. Ferguson, the archaeologist who worked on this case, isn't here, I'm going to tell two little stories. The Zunis were really serious about this, and the religious leaders went out with us and documented locations where we needed to look at. And TJ's out there, we're in the back country someplace, and there's a stone seat about this high and a few rusty cans around. And he asks what it is, and they say, in what sounded like Zuni, it's a shrine to Eddies or something like that. So he dutifully wrote it down in his notebook, and it wasn't until a few days later that we realized that the cans were all beer cans, and the Eddies was the closest place off the reservation where you could buy beer. On another occasion, I was out with the religious leaders south of Zuni, and we were quite a ways from even a good dirt road. And this was a complete setup. These guys asked me to come over and look on this in this pile of basalt. It was a pile of basalt about this high, and there was a hole in the middle of it. And they said, climb up on top and look down in there. Bend over and look in. And so I climbed up on top, and I'm standing right on top, and I bend over and look in, and it's a pit of rattlesnakes. There are about 15 of them, and they're rattling and hissing. And I jump off the back of this pile of rocks into the sand. And Barton Martza, I believe it was, the head councilman, says with a completely straight face, well, what do you know? White men can jump. So we, after bloody hearing in the late 80s, 1990, and Floyd was involved right to the end in those hearings, doing expert testimony and writing and testifying. And we finally, the United States decided to do what they called a global settlement, which meant they wanted to settle both cases. And they eventually settled them for $50 million. Half of that money, we worked up a law to invest it in a sustainable agriculture program, which is still going and which has resulted in bringing back thousands of acres of agriculture on the reservation, which had been lost as a result of the government's actions and inactions relating to the trust land. So as I approach the age of 70, this is one thing Floyd didn't tell me about, is how do you retire from working for tribes? And I found it's a little more difficult than I thought, but it's to me, it's been a wonderful, rewarding experience, and This is just one small slice, an example of the kind of work that Floyd and the American West Center have done over the years. And this has had a huge impact on the Zuni tribe. And it was my pleasure and honor to work with Floyd and the American West Center as part of this project. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your work. Perhaps the greatest, actually I'm going to start out by saying there's these testimonies in court are probably the greatest contribution people like Floyd have made to Indian people, because we're talking about millions of dollars and millions of acres of land that have been preserved or settled with the United States. So I want to start off by seconding what you said earlier about the importance and also how important history is to public policy. So I want to congratulate you all for the work you do. I keep wanting to go to the second page, I don't know why. When I graduated from college, I figured the best way to help my people would be by providing educational opportunities. My people are the Utes. Because of my own struggles with self-identity and poor self-esteem, the importance of learning one's true history and culture became evident to me, and I became aware of our youth's critical challenges and struggles to find their place in the world. I'm fortunate to have known Floyd, Gregory included, in the American West Center, going back to my position with the Ute tribe in 1973 as education director. Well, that's a long time ago, 40-some years ago. And as Greg said, everything began with the Doris Duke Foundation. And in '71, I recall meeting Dr. S. Lyman Tyler, who was also part of the work effort moving forward. Anyway, besides working with such tribes as the Zuni Pueblo, the American West Center has engaged in the development of series of histories of Great Basin tribes. The first was the Southern Ute History, first production, published in 1972. I think Gregory was involved in that one with Jim Jefferson. Then Ute Stories, or Stories of Our Ancestors, the Ute book, published 2 years later, 1974. Then there were 4 on the Nevada tribes, published in 1976. Then the Walker River workbook followed in 1977. A History of Northern Ute People by Kaneda and Floyd, of course, was not published until 1982. The manuscript sat on a shelf in my office for about a year and a half. And I remember calling Floyd one day and saying, Floyd, what are we going to do with this manuscript? Fred's gone. We got to do something. And he said, well, let's get it published. So he gave me some cost parameters. I went to the business committee. They gave us enough money to publish. We printed, I don't know how many, I think about 3,000 the first time. So that was one of the first major publications, well, second, but in my mind, the most important because it dealt with history. And by the way, boys, we need to do another one because a lot has happened since that one. Along with what I said earlier, I think Floyd and a fellow by the name of John Jurius, who happens to be very controversial because he was the oil and gas advisor to the Ute tribe at a time when very few people realized this in the early 80s. No, rather the latter 80s. This is after I had gone into exile to help my ex-wife's tribe, the Wampanoag people. We almost went broke. We could not make payroll a few times. And John Jurius happened to be on board. And according to my son, a lot of work was done to round up some investors and keep the budget going, keeping the tribe operational. And then the leases were executed under a company, a tribally owned company called Ute Energy. And different story since then. Made a bundle of money, and that was sold for various reasons. But it really got the tribe off and running again. But that's part of the history. And again, people like Floyd, their testimony in court, John Jurius is business savvy. That's what's kept us going. The Ute Curriculum Project. We got a grant from the U.S. Department of Education right around this time. And I came and we talked to Floyd about this, and because we'd done work with a history book, we talked about putting together a curriculum, graded curriculum for our students. I remember I had to get off the plane. I flew in from Vernal to Salt Lake. I had to get off the plane, catch a taxi across town, get Floyd to sign the application, get back on the plane, fly to Washington, D.C. And when I got there, we got there late. It was like about 11:30. The hotel had given up my room. I had to walk about 2.5 blocks to this dark, poverty-stricken area. I made it. Next day, the grant deadline was next day. I went and I remember just throwing the proposals into the big basket there because it was such a trial for me. But we got it funded, and these are the results of some of our efforts. These maps, I used them when I was teaching a course on Ute history for Utah State University. This was also taught in the high schools. We had a whole set of curriculum materials, and I remember at the time that teachers were always saying, well, we've run out of the materials. Sometimes they'd use that as an excuse. So nowadays we put them online. So I don't know if we ever put the old materials online. Might be another project. Anyway, moving on. Around this time, the West Center was engaged in archives collections for a number of the tribes in our area. I believe Floyd said there were about 4 archival collections completed. Is that correct? About 4?
That's with the tribes?
Yeah.
16.
16? Oh my God. Well, divided by 4. Well, close enough. Anyway, these are the ones I'm familiar with. And I remember a fellow by the name of Myron Akutterud, who was one of the members of the business committee. I remember he was one of the guys that went back there with Floyd, Gregory and company, and I remember hearing him, the story that he said after spending all day for weeks on end copying documents, archives, and organizing them, and they finally got back to the reservation, and he said, you guys have lost your damn minds to do that kind of work. He just couldn't understand. But it all got work. It broke Floyd's heart, I remember, and when back in probably 1978, and they stored the archives in the basement of the Bottle Hollow Resort, and it flooded. They get damaged, about 1/3 of the collection, but we've continued to move on from there. As I stated, probably litigation is one of the most important areas American West Centers Floyd has made Indian tribes, my tribe in particular, work on Termination Act, termination of affiliated land settlements, boundaries, right-of-way, more recently jurisdiction and ancestral rights and claims for federal recognition. Federal acknowledgement is what they call it now, right? And as you might know, some of those claims are accurate and some of them are not. a lot of fraud out there, a lot of people wanting a quick buck. So they use the minute ancestry they might have of Indian blood and try to squeeze the most they can out of it. And so sometimes their claims are accurate and sometimes not. When I worked as director of the Division of Indian Affairs, Floyd used to call me and say, "Come join Sir Gregory and I for lunch so I can laugh at the back of your head." I got in trouble because I tried to use the phrase with another friend and cut it short by saying, "Come over so I can laugh at your head." This was not good. But at least I did not say laugh at your face. So that happened many times we hang out with Floyd and Greg. At some of these meetings, we would discuss some of the problems and we'd scheme and laugh, many times at state policy. And that's probably why I got fired. No, jokingly, we had a lot of fun together, and we shared a lot of our thoughts on history and what was happening in the tribe, history to contemporary times, why things happened the way they did, and even up to the present time. So it's been a joyful experience. Floyd figured out how to teach and be his own boss, thanks to the American West Center. It's a wonder Floyd did not get into more trouble, but I guess it helps to have a attractive, smart attorney as your wife. I think Shauna's back there. I'm pleased to be part of and consider myself part of the history, the true historians in this area, and the buffs like me. You see, I never acquired all the necessary credentials to be a historian. Nevertheless, I was able to cause enough trouble by reminding the state of its pioneer history. It began in my alma mater, Wasatch Academy, when they called on me to head up their social studies department. I remember the headmaster calling me, Joe Lofton. "Forrest, why don't you come teach history?" I said, "Joe, I don't have a credential for history." He said, "I don't care, we're a private school. You give powerful demonstrations, fly on out here." So I did. And I had to bone up on history real pronto. Then when I became Director of Indian Affairs, I inherited a book project, one that would, in later years, put me square in the middle of the Mountain Meadows Massacre controversy with my friend Bagley over there. Where's Will? There he is. We had a lot of fun with that one, didn't we? The history project was initiated in 1997 by my predecessor, Will Numkina, as part of the state's bicentennial, sequicentennial, one of the two. The first draft of the Paiute manuscript did not contain the Mountain Meadows Massacre, so I called the chairperson, the late Janelle Anderson, one of my favorite chair people. I said, "Janelle, why was the massacre omitted?" And she said, "Forrest, the people are afraid of retaliation from the Mormon Church." I said, "Don't be. This is a state-funded project, and it needs to reflect the Paiute version of this historic event." A few months later, the manuscript was amended with a Paiute version, which states essentially they were not involved. It was 60 members of the Mormon militia who were responsible. The Paiutes did not conspire, nor could they possibly be considered co-conspirators. And of course, lately, I think most of us agree there may have been one or two Paiutes involved. But more accurately, Shoshone lore says that there were two, but they weren't Paiute. They were Shoshone, Bannock, and part of Pocatello's band, and they were hiding out down there because they'd been attacking wagon trains coming across the Oregon Trail. And they happened to be in that area. They did join the militia. They were part of it. Again, there may have been one or two Paiutes. Story's still out.
They were freebooters. They offered free cattle and to anybody who wanted a guaranteed deal. The Mormon medicine would protect them. there were no doubt some native freebooters who showed up.
Yeah.
And as soon as a couple of them got shot, they left.
Yeah, yeah. He delves in the area where I stay completely clear of, and that is Brigham Young's involvement. I basically end my story with the Paiutes. So anyway, we had a lot of fun with that, and again, I grew up in a public school, and I remember in the school it was about 50-50 youth kids, white kids. And I remember the teacher talking about the MMM. I remember the teacher making it very clear that the Paiutes were responsible for killing the Fancher Baker Party, all 120 of them. And I remember the white kids peering over at us, and luckily we had an equal number of Indian kids peering back at them. So this was an important story for me, to deal with, because it goes back to the real life hurt situations that exists in history from time to time, and especially in dealing with Indian tribes, right? It's real stuff. Then in 2006 and 2007, we learned about the national PBS special presentation entitled "We Shall Remain." PBS folks were marketing 5 major productions featuring certain key segments in American Indian history. One was on the Pilgrims encounter in New England tribes, Geronimo, Aim, Cherokee, Trail of Tears, I forget the other one. I complained once again, the Great Basin tribes were omitted. And Ken Verdoya, vice president, one of the KUED divisions was there. He said, well, Forrest, why don't we do something about it? Let's go up to the legislature and propose funding, see if they'll fund it. We needed 5 28-minute videos and a graded curriculum on all the tribes. And so we did, and we got it funded. After the money came through, we wrote KUED in, of course. We didn't write the American West Center in, but it was easy to sole source because there's no one else comparable that did this kind of work. So we sole sourced this work to the American West Center. Elizabeth Player, a teacher with curriculum expertise, had just relocated into the state and was hired to produce the curriculum. She did a great job. Materials were completed in 2006. About this time, Indian Affairs began to digitize, work to digitize with much of the publications as possible in cooperation with American West Center. Again, back in the 70s when we were developing curriculum, they were always complaining, well, it's out of print. Well, we put these all on digitized online. So they can't say that anymore. And unfortunately, they're not using them. They're not using this material to the extent that it needs to be used. It's been a wonderful time these past 40 plus years. We've had a lot of fun. To borrow Floyd's old saying, live it up, and we did. In conclusion, I thought I would share this tiny bit of wisdom, which reminds me of Floyd. It's called Old Dogs. An old Doberman starts chasing rabbits and before long discovers he's lost. Wandering about, he notices a panther heading rapidly in his direction with the intention of having lunch. The old Doberman thinks, oh, I'm in deep doo-doo now. Noticing some bones on the ground close by, he immediately settles down to chew on the bones with his back to the approaching cat. Just as the panther is about to leap, the old Doberman exclaims loudly, boy, that was one delicious panther. I wonder if there are any more around here. Hearing this, the young panther halts his attack in mid-strike. A look of terror comes over him, and he slinks away into the trees. Whew, says the panther. That was close. That old Doberman nearly had me. Meanwhile, a squirrel had been watching the whole scene from a nearby tree. He figures he can put this knowledge to good use and trade it for protection from the panther. So off he goes. The squirrel soon catches up with the panther, spills the beans, and strikes a deal for himself with the panther. The young panther is furious at being made a fool of and says, "Here, squirrel, hop on my back and see what's going to happen to that conniving canine." Now, the old Doberman sees the panther coming with the squirrel on his back and thinks, "What am I going to do?" But instead of running, the dog sits down with his back to his attackers, pretending he hasn't seen them yet. And just when they get close enough to hear, the old Doberman says, "Where's that squirrel? I sent him off an hour ago to bring me another panther." The moral of the story is, don't mess with old dogs. Age and skill will always overcome youth and treachery. Besides, bullshit and brilliance only come with age and experience. Thank you.
My name is Vince Mayer. I worked with now 40 some odd years ago, worked with Floyd and Greg at the American West Center. I look back on that particular period as probably the most enjoyable and also the most academically beneficial time I had during my graduate student career. When Floyd asked me to come on board and work on the Oral History Project, or a project on the history of the Spanish-speaking people of community in Utah, I was really quite intrigued and also quite enthusiastic. For one reason, my parents were both immigrants from Mexico coming here and eventually settling here in the 30s. And also I had had with previous association with Floyd, I was able to make the acquaintance of Helen Papanikolaou, who had been doing work with the Greek community. And through Floyd and Greek showed me how much she had done, and particularly through with Helen's infectious enthusiasm, just prompted me to want to get involved in something like this. Another impetus for me joining on was I recognized that I wanted to, I was at this point just beginning my work on was to be my doctoral dissertation, working with about 100 years of 17th century provincial documents of San Jose de Parral of northern New Spain at that time, the mining frontier. And even though I was deep into that, I realized that this opportunity to work with Floyd provided me a chance to really spread my academic wings, and not only in terms of history, but in terms of writing and all the other possibilities that this project entailed. And finally, on a practical basis, it offered me a job, since I was a married graduate student with 2 kids, and fellowship money was still a ways off. When let's see, I have some notes. Both my grandson and my wife often accuse me of wandering about. So when we first began the project, we were really beginning with a tabla rasa. There was literally nothing there, and that was also one of the reasons I had wanted to get involved on this, because even in my high school and university days, realized there was no real information about the the experience of the Spanish-speaking population of Utah. But as I say, when we got started, we found absolutely, well, literally nothing. And so we began throwing our net out under Floyd's guidance, looking at, as good historians, at every source we could: federal documents, state documents, newspapers, baptismal records, birth and death records of the Catholic Church, the Mormon Church, on and on and on, until we were able to bring together a pretty good skeleton, or at least a point of departure for looking at this history. And granted, this population was probably the most recent and numerically modest of those that had come to Utah. So that was another difficulty. At that point, we realized that the other component, that of oral history, would probably give us, we're probably going to depend more on it than we would probably under other circumstances. And at this point, I was particularly enthusiastic because, as I say, having Mexican immigrant parents, and also having grown up at the early part of my life, remember growing up and living under the railroad houses, under the viaduct there, across from the Union Pacific Depot. And so my early life was very much seeped, very much that of the almost exclusively the Mexican community on the west side. That it was until we moved to Woods Cross, Utah, which was a cultural shock for me. But as I say, the oral history component was, as I say, a particularly interesting and exciting one to me, because many of the contemporaries of my parents were going to be the ones that we were going to at least initially start interviewing. And also, during my undergraduate years, I had paid my way through college working on the railroad, laying track during the summers on the Union Pacific Railroad, which is, I often look back and I wonder whether my love of history or the prospect of another 30 years as a Gandhi dancer on the Union Pacific Railroad was the greatest impetus for pursuing an academic career. At any rate, when we began the oral the process of conducting interviews, I once again was very enthusiastic. Among the other individuals we were going to be interviewing were a number of friends that I had made, old-timers I call them at that point in my life, with whom I had worked on the railroad during the summers. And many people talk about the art of conversation, and you really will find what the art of conversation is when I did at any rate, when I was working with some of those old timers, and particularly in the summertime, you would work 4, 6, 8 hours or weeks just tamping rails with your lollipop, as we used to call it. And you have your partner there, your tamping rail. And if there's a silence for 6, 8 weeks, you're probably going to put that lollipop where it might not do the best good. But these old timers really knew how to carry on a conversation. They would chat about current affairs, their life, what was going on, sports, everything. And as I began becoming more acquainted with these individuals, I used to, and this is before I obviously joined this project, I would start asking them, when did you come to Utah? Why did you come? What was life like in the Depression here in Utah? What was life like until the Union really got going with you on the railroad. And these guys would talk in a very slow, deliberate way, because they were stretching out the conversation for the rest of the day. And it was interesting to see the way these conversations would go. They would talk, and one fellow would relate some experiences for an hour or two, and then it would be picked up by one of my other colleagues who was tamping rail on the other side. And the fascination I found at that time with what I later learned was oral history was truly enlightening to me. And as I say, that was another reason why I became so enthusiastic about this dimension of this project of documenting the Spanish-speaking community in Utah. Let me just digress, even though it has not a lot to do, in fact, nothing to do with the topic at hand, other than the word Gandhi dancer. When I was back in the department, one day we'd not often, but at times we would have Christmas parties or a birthday party, and when I was running the Office of Caribbean Affairs, I had about 9 or 10 young officers, mid-grade, junior officers working for me. And we had, at the end of the day, we were sitting around and after work, and we were talking, and some of the younger officers started talking about the work that they had done before they came into the Foreign Service. Well, some had worked in a bakery, some had done parole officers, the whole range of possibilities in terms of employment. And one of the younger officers, I remember her, Annie Forsheimer, she said to you, "And what did you do when?" I said, "Well, I worked in an oil refinery. I worked for FL-CIO Cope. I did this. I slung hash. I worked at a research center. I was a Gandhi dancer undergraduate, working my way through college as an undergraduate. I was a Gandhi dancer." And sort of the room got very quiet there. And Annie sort of looked at me, and I looked at her, and I knew what she wanted to say, and she knew that I knew what she wanted to say. Because she wanted, I said, "No, Annie, it's nothing like the Chippendales." When I explained what Gandhi dancer is, as I understand it, was most of the tools used by on the railroad, spike mauls, the tamping bars, spike claws, were made by a company called Gandhi. And if you've ever seen workers tamping rail, they have a partner there, but they have a little sort of motion, and apparently that is where the word Gandhi dancer comes. You are doing your own little dance as you're working along with this very heavy bar. But again, I digress a bit. At any rate, when we completed, after several years of this program, which was essentially run on a shoestring financially, and Floyd knew how to really make that shoestring continue going out. But even though it was a relatively small project with vis-a-vis the history of the Spanish-speaking people in Utah, we still were able to put together the basic format, framework, number of papers that would form the basis for at least a look or into the history of the Spanish-speaking immigrants. In addition, we were able to develop curricular materials and produce a number of occasional papers, and also a chapter in the 1976 edition of Utah Peoples, edited by Helen Papanicholas. But I think, as many people have discussed, as I think back on it more and more, I think one of the most important results out of this particular project, for me particularly, was that the realization that Floyd and the center trained a legion of graduates and undergraduates in the work of serious and rigorous research, writing, and critical thinking. And it not only trained a lot of these students for an academic career, but in careers that they have pursued outside of academia. I can only add my thanks to Floyd for all that he has imparted to me in terms of knowledge and experience on the academic side. And let me also digress. When I joined the Department of State in 1976, it was because of Floyd O'Neill that I became a diplomat rather than an academic. I recall in, I guess it was 75, early 75, I don't recall exactly when, I had received a notice from the Department of State that they wanted me to take the oral exam, the next step. You have the written, oral, and then you have rankings, and then they ask you to come and join. But it was going to be taking place in Denver. And I said, who the hell has money to go to Denver to take an oral exam for the Foreign Service, and who the hell wants a skinny Mexican in the Foreign Service? So Floyd at that point said, don't be silly, go and try it. You have to go to Denver to do some more work in the archives. All we'll do is move up your time, and you take a day off, and you work those 3 or 4 days you need to work in the archives, and go take your exam. And after a bit of humming and hawing, I said, well, okay. So I went to Denver, did my work in the archives, and then I think the last day I went show up for the oral exam in the federal building there. And I recall there was another chap there who was there very uptight. You could tell this is what he wanted to do more than anything in the world. But I remember looking at him, and there he was in his pinstripe suit, black wingtip shoes, silk tie, blonde, blue-eyed, tall. I almost walked out. I said, what the hell am I doing here? I was here in my little sport coat and trousers. I almost that close to walking out. I said, oh, what the hell? I will just take the oral exam, which was about 4.5 hours. Very rigorous exam. Ran me through my paces. And once I did it, I thought, oh, that was sort of fun. And I look back on it, and I said, probably the only reason I may have done as well as I did on that exam was because I was thoroughly convinced that I was not the type of candidate that they were looking for. But at any rate, about 9 months later, after I had fortunately received an offer for an academic position down in Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, I interviewed, and they offered me the job, and the following day, the State Department offers me a job, saying, we want you to come in the Junior Officer Corps. And after some discussion with my wife, I won't go through it, we decided on a Foreign Service career. And but once again, the only reason I have a Foreign Service career is because of Floyd O'Neill and Fidel Castro and Manuel Noriega and a few others may not like it, but that's what happens. But once again, let me just close with saying that anyone who's worked with Floyd has had nothing but the greatest benefit of wisdom, and also has been often the greatest object of ridicules on a 7-day-a-week basis. But once again, Floyd, I do want to thank you for some wonderful training, wonderful memories, and some wonderful work that we did while I was there in the American West Center.
It feels like a big family reunion today, Floyd, doesn't it? Yeah. We're all lucky to be part of the American West family. Greg asked me to talk a little bit about voting rights, and I'm glad to do that. But my hope is that I connect with you and tell you a little bit about how my experience at the American West Center and working on voting rights cases has shaped my leadership and my management style since I've moved to another center. And I hope I can do that. We'll see. It's going to be a little experiment up here. I came to the American West Center in 1999, and I had been immersed in politics. I'd been at the White House. I had worked for the legislature, and the only reason I came to the American West Center was because Dan McCool, a poli-sci faculty member, was there. I had no idea the experiences that I would have because of people like Floyd and Greg Smoke and Winston and of course Dan and others that were there. The center was really going through a transformation period, I think, at the time, and I imagine that was the case in a lot of historical research centers. You were having funding that was constricted. There wasn't enough support from academic institutions. That certainly was the case there. And Dan had shifted a little bit our goals and our priorities. He was interested in oral histories, but it was about veterans, and he was very interested in voting rights and public policy work. And I fit really nicely into that because of my own interests. He was asked by the ACLU and the Department of Justice to start working on voting rights cases for American Indians and to be an expert witness in these cases. He asked if I would support him and do some research in that area, and I was glad to do it. The Voting Rights Act was passed in '65, and you probably know there are a number of amendments that happened in 1970, 1975, 82, 92, and most recently in 2006. Most of us think of the voting rights as impacting the South and impacting blacks, right? But it had an enormous impact on American Indians as well. There was a quote by an ACLU attorney when he was doing a case in Montana, and he'd been up in Montana a number of times, and he said something, I'm paraphrasing, something along the lines of, what's happening to American Indians in the 80s and 90s is what we saw happening to blacks in the 40s and 50s and 60s. It was unbelievable, the kind of discrimination, the disenfranchisement, the vote dilution that was happening. Most of us don't even know about it. In fact, Dan and I knew just very little. So our job was to start cataloging, to look at all the voting rights cases that had happened over the years. And we came up with, I think there were 75 at the time we did that, 75 voting rights cases on behalf of American Indians. It was fascinating, and Dan worked on cases in South Dakota. I think he worked on cases in Montana, and he's done a number of them since. Most recently, he's up in Alaska doing cases. But what I learned from it are four things, and I'm calling them kind of the cornerstones of my experience from the American West Center. And it's first, you meet the public need. We heard a lot about that this morning from Richard White, right? The question comes from the public, and you meet the public need. The second is you have high scholarly standards. You just don't let those things go. You build on your talent, and then you create an office environment that is conducive to teamwork, those scholarly standards, to meeting the public need, and to being humble. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about those things, and I can share my story about the voting rights cases. We traveled to the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. in the ACLU office, which is located in Atlanta, Georgia. Spent probably weeks there in storage rooms, going through file boxes, pulling up records, not something a political science student is used to, but probably all of you historians are really familiar with that. And standing next to a Xeroxer for 8 hours a day, Xeroxing the filings and the court decisions and all of the documentation that went along with those 75 cases. And then we had to come home and catalog those and go through them and put together a case for Dan to be an expert witness. It involved traveling to some of the locations and gathering voting rights records from the county clerks to look back and see how American Indian participation in city or county or school board elections has changed. Dan, I think at the time, had 2 cases that were up front, and both cases came out in favor of the plaintiffs. That's the value and the impact of what the American West Center did. You heard from Richard, we heard from Forrest about litigation on behalf of Indians in terms of fishing, hunting rights, lands claims. This was on voting rights. And I just think the power of what the American West Center created was that power to meet the public need and to make the nation better. I really believe that. And it's 50 years of that, Floyd. It's 50 years. It's amazing. But it also involved really high scholarly standards. Simply because you're working for a client and you're getting funded doesn't mean you abandoned your standards, right? You still gather all your data. You still do your analysis. For me, that's quantitative analysis, number crunching. You still do that. You make sure your findings match your analysis. And as you said earlier, you don't stretch a rat's ass over a rain barrel. That little term, that little phrase, comes back to me frequently. You don't stretch a rat's ass over a rain barrel. And as I work, I know, poor Floyd, he's dying. And as I work with graduate students, now I have 5 that are working for me this year, I try to remind them, I don't use that phrase, Floyd, but I try to remind them to make sure you are really connecting your data, your findings, and your reporting. They have to match. And then I think the other things I want to talk about is the importance of building talent. A lot of us who've been up here, we were graduate students when we were at the American West Center. I was doing a master's and then I went on to do a PhD. And the importance of building up your talent, hiring the right people to come on, but identifying their strengths and growing those strengths out so that they can be successful and your organization as a whole can be successful. That is something that I've seen over and over and over through the entire history of the American West Center. And Greg, you've continued to do that with the students that you've brought on board. And I think that's an amazing legacy. And the many people in this room who we feel like we're family of that center have been touched by that over the years. It's one of those unique places on a college campus that you learn and you stay and keep your connection. And I think that brings me to the last point about the value of relationships at the American West Center. How many people work there in this room, right? How many still talk to Floyd regularly? Yeah, right.
The other way around, he talks to us.
Yeah, he talks to us. It's that value of relationships and the beauty of building an office environment that is supportive. It's around teamwork, and it's about humility too. And for the American West Center, I don't believe you've ever done the work to build the reputation of the American West Center. It was always about meeting the need of the client, whoever that was, whether it was a tribe or in our case, the ACLU or the Justice Department or the Division of Indian Affairs, whoever it might be. It wasn't about your own reputation being grown or the reputation of the center. That came as a result of your good work. But it was the environment that you created to ensure that we could do quality work, that we had a fun time, that we were well fed with pretzels and peanuts and iced tea. And all of those things are really valuable and important. As we worked through the voting rights cases, those 4 cornerstones really became evident to me through those. It was hard work. The quality of our work could never dive, even though it was funded and we were producing a product for somebody else to use. Our ethical standards never waver, right? We maintained a positive office environment even through difficult and challenging times and budget cuts and pressure from college that's unpleasant. And you gave me and others in the room this opportunity to grow our talents. And that's just been an amazing gift. So thank you. I know we have one more. Will is going to come up and share a little bit more about this latest stage of the center as it shifted back to Matt Basso and to Greg Smoke.
It's the 7th inning. It's time to stand up and stretch out and shake your arms. Stand up. One thing I learned from Floyd was dealing with constant pain. And the deal is to just get used to it. Come up with the therapies that work, but endure it. And since Floyd has been such a constant pain in so many pompous asses, it's a thoroughly appropriate approach. In 1886, an Army officer at Pine Ridge authorized Red Cloud's son, Red Cloud, and a few friends to visit the Shoshone Reservation in Wyoming. Along with several hundred Oglalas, Red Cloud extended his trip to the White Rocks Agency in what was left of the once princely domain, to use Floyd O'Neill's term, of the Utes, to swap red pipestone calumets and beadwork for Ute buckskins and some of the Uinta's White Rivers and Uncompahgre band's 12,000 really fine horses. The Utes feasted their former rivals and spent at least a week trading and dancing. The agent recalled they enjoyed themselves as white people usually enjoy a 4th of July barbecue. And the term barbecue brings me to a paragraph that was initially in a different spot in the presentation. But I realized I was supposed, initially in the program, you'll notice, I was supposed to follow Greg's introductions and Richard White's discourse on public history, which as a public historian I found compelling and fascinating, and as always with Richard's material, mentally engaging and inspirational and challenging. But he also handled basically the presentation I thought I was supposed to give, which is titled, "Sometimes the Rat's Ass Needs Stretching. History, the American West Center, and Floyd A. O'Neill." And the great man looks pained at the moment. But I've often thought that Floyd was the uncredited lyricist for Randy Newman's Short People, because when Floyd would invite me to lunch, he'd say, I think this is a precise quote for us, he wanted to laugh at the shape of my head, and he always took comments on my lack of stature, my physical lack of stature. But speaking of barbecues, this is later in the speech. Professor O'Neill's professional career as a teacher, advisor, and administrator began with his graduation from the University of Utah in 1959. He ran the American West Center for decades and served 10 years as its director. Despite repeated prodding from a host of testosterone-driven, vengeful center veterans to roast their former boss, I am here to praise O'Neill, not to barbecue the old goat. I come to celebrate a great scholar, mentor, manager, and conjurer of cash at the very first center devoted to the interdisciplinary study of the American West. And I'll get to the rest of it later, but Since Richard handled that so brilliantly, I will forego that vow not to barbecue somebody and engage in a series of recollections and anecdotes. But first of all, I want to get back and complete the story of that forgotten visit of the Lakota to the Ute Agency in 1886. What the three nations, the Shoshone, Utes, and Lakota, discussed in 1886 was probably much more interesting than a barbecue. Shortly after this trek, the Lakota took up the ghost dance, which the northern Paiute shaman Wovoka said would resurrect the native dead and bring back the buffalo. The Utes had practiced the ghost dance since at least 1870. Perhaps they spoke of it with their visitors in 1886. 20 years after Red Cloud's visit, and a year after President Theodore Roosevelt withdrew 1.1 million acres from the Uinta Reservation to create a national forest reserve in 1905, Redcap told the Ute people at the bear dance, "The white people have robbed us of our cattle, our pony grass, and our hunting grounds," and called for them to journey north and join the Lakota. Several hundred Utes made the long march from the Uinta Basin to Pine Ridge. Their dream of forging an alliance came to naught, but the flight of the Utes proved that Indians have long memories. And the complete disappearance of this story from Utah's history indicates that the state's historians did not. I had an interesting experience last week when I went to bear witness to about the fifth ceremony at Mountain Meadows to dedicate monuments put up by the Mormon Church as atonement for the Mountain Meadows massacre. It was a very low-key event, which you would expect since they were dedicating the monument to mark the spot where the women and children were murdered. But they did invite the descendants groups and all three of the Mountain Meadows organizations that compete to remember the massacre as a public memory. And I must say, I was expecting, I smelled a rat, and I thought something was up. But I had to admit that they conducted these ceremonies with dignity and respect, and they did honor the families and the people connected to this event personally. And they also have assumed a great public responsibility to preserve a spot that is the hardest place for them to remember in the long experience of the Mormons, which is, of course, Mountain Meadows. One of the activities that I engaged in before we left was to contact my friend Logan Hebner, who Richard White knows from the the famous restaurant in Springville near Zion Park, the Bit and Spur. And Logan has written probably the best book ever done, or maybe ever will be, called Southern Paiute, as a collection of portraits and an amazing set of Paiute voices speaking for themselves and telling their own story. And I encouraged Logan to come to the commemoration and to make sure, if possible, to get Laura Tom, a former tribal chairwoman, and some other Paiutes to also to come and bear witness. And we didn't know what these monuments would say, and in the past, by implication, they've said nothing except that a massacre happened here. And as James Lewin observed in his book on bad historical monuments, in southern Utah, bad things happen in the passive voice, and the simple use of the term massacre to most Americans conveys Indians killing whites. And all the earliest marking of these public monuments in fact, did avoid any declaration of who did it or any implication that white people were killing white people, which is what makes the Mountain Meadows Massacre such a singular event in the frontier West. But there were two Paiutes, Arthur Richards and a younger man, and they came and they watched and witnessed. And Logan said that when Arthur got back, he had a conversation with him, and Logan said, after watching all this, white people don't listen very well. And in fact, we don't. We're the winners, and it's easy for us to tell history as we would like history to be told, as all people have done through all time. But as virtually everyone with a background in history has observed here, truth will out, and deep research will vindicate the past and what really happened. And the most telling discovery in Mormon records that anyone has made in Mormon annals was done by Mike Quinn in 1997 when he published for the first time Nephi Johnson, a young lieutenant in the Nauvoo Legion who had probably supervised the murder of the women and children by white men dressed as Indians. And Johnson told Apostle Francis Lyman, white men did most of the killing. And to me, that is the most important insight that we can gain from what has been a massively researched subject. Now, there are exceptions to historians who forgot. In 1968, the son of a Uinta Valley farmer, Carbon County coal miner, Floyd A. O'Neill, a former public school teacher and graduate student, published an anguished odyssey, The Flight of the Utes, 1906 to 1908, in the Utah Historical Quarterly. This brilliant article lyrically summarized the plight of the Utes at the dawn of the 20th century. In the living memory of many of these people, they had watched the white man seize political control, virtually destroy their way of life, occupy their lands, and force them to live with a fort guarding the interests of the white man. In 1906, the Vernal Express reported, "Indian trouble of gigantic proportions is brewing." As a band of 321 White River Utes camped on Dry Fork, all well armed and with ammunition in abundance, they also had 1,000 head of horses and about 50 cattle. They said they were going to the northern reservations to join a great gathering of all the Indians of the West and freely expressed their determination to fight rather than return. Wilson Johnson, son of one of the Utes who fled, told O'Neill in 1967 that the reason for the journey was to make an alliance with the Sioux to resist further white encroachment. By the time the wandering Nuche reached the North Platte, 700 Utes were slaughtering cattle and sheep, robbing ranches and committing depredations, a Cheyenne newspaper reported. O'Neill's article called forth a watershed event in Native history, but one so entirely forgotten that the Quarterly's editor, renowned as Mr. Utah History, doubted it had ever happened. That was all about to change. When Floyd O'Neill began his work as a graduate student, I read that already. The State of Western History in 1964. No, I hadn't read that already. When Floyd O'Neill began working as a graduate student at the American West Center in 1966, the region's story was beginning its slow transformation. This change ignited a revolution and reinterpretation of the old Western history, which chronicled the conquest, industrialization, and exploitation of the American West as a celebration of the heroic Protestant Anglo-Europeans and their exceptional and benevolent religious and corporate institutions that made this wonderful progress to civilization possible. Women, native peoples, blacks, Hispanics, and ethnic peoples ranging from the French and the Greeks to the Slavs, and certainly to the Mexicans, to the Japanese, and to union and labor activists, had largely vanished from the popular narrative. Now, the state of Western history in 1964 was more complicated than this caricature, but sometimes the rat's ass needs stretching, and somebody had to stretch this title rat's ass to create a broader new Western history that delivered a more accurate, inclusive, and honest representation of the region and its roots. O'Neill's scholarly investigation of the Ute Nation history challenged the established interpretation with Indian voices and sources. Despite his advisor's advice that Indian history was a ticket to nowhere, O'Neill's 1973 dissertation, A History of the Ute Indians of Utah until 1890, discarded traditional distortions and demolished popular justifications. For 48 years, he has helped fund the American West Center and assembled the Doris Duke Indian Oral History Project, which has collected 1,030 taped interviews featuring some 2,000 native voices. Now, I learned firsthand the meaning of the biblical scripture, a prophet is not without honor, save in his own country and in his own house. Now, I'd always known that Floyd was quite respected by his fellow Utah Westerners, but he'd always seemed to be sort of on the wrong side of the pale, as my English ancestors said about their colony in Ireland. But I learned that Floyd was a major figure in the history of the West when I attended my first Western History Association convention in St. Paul in 1995. And as I walked into the lobby of the hotel where it was being held, I saw Professor O'Neill was at the head of a long line of people waiting to talk to him and share past experiences, memories, and ask for future advice. This was certainly reinforced when Floyd dedicated 2 weeks to showing me the ropes in the National Archives. And when we showed up in Washington, the senior staff of the archives heard that Professor O'Neill was there, and they all came down to greet him. Now, as Richard White observed years ago, Professor O'Neill put history in the harness and put it to work. Floyd's contributions include capturing tribal histories, establishing oral history as a valuable historical resource, and inspiring generations of students and aspiring historians. As he eloquently said in The Peoples of Utah, confined on reservations, no longer free to range over mountains and deserts of their lands in the incessant quest for food, the hard-pressed Utes never completely forgot how they were supposed to live, who they were, and where they came from. The elders handed this knowledge down to them in family teepees, during tribal ceremonies, and in the everyday practice of religion and acknowledgement of their myths. He supported Connor Chapusa's policies with scholarship and cash. Teach him to speak Ute, and don't let him ever forget how we're supposed to live, who we are, where we came from. The American West Center may be this maverick historian's finest and, we hope, most enduring legacy. As a bulwark of public history in an increasingly corporatized academic world where clueless careers serve the interests of the new racketeering robber barons of the re-gilded age, who seek to turn universities into outposts of elitism in the service of transferring wealth from thems that got very little to thems that got virtually all of it. We need public institutions like the American West Center to serve students and the people. And we desperately need more maverick historians like Floyd O'Neill to comfort the afflicted, discomfort the comfortable, and remind us who we are and where we came from. But while the old goat is staggering to the podium, I will thank him publicly for the virtual PhD he conducted with me over countless free lunches, and I will forgive him for laughing at the shape of my head. But notice how leery I am of that cane.
And he needs to be. Well, I never did comment about your stature except to say you were a bit short to comfortably kick a duck in the butt. I seldom use aphorisms, as they will tell you. I want to move rapidly as I can. This is a time to say thank you. I want to say thank you to Doris Duke, to the U of U General Funds, to the Utah Mineral Lease Funds, to the National Endowment for the Humanities, 6 grants working with 9 tribes, the U.S. Department of Interior BI Educational Division, 3 grants, Ford Foundation, 2 grants, Donner Foundation of New York, 3 grants, Donner Foundation of Canada, 1, the Marriott Library, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Utah State Department of Education, the Nevada State Department of Education, the Southern Ute Tribe, the Uinta Ouray Ute Tribe, the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe, Koopa Valley Indian Tribe of California, San Juan County, Utah School District, Shoshone-Bannock Tribes of Idaho, Lummi Tribe of Washington, Walker River Tribe of Nevada, U.S. Department of Justice, the Zuni Pueblo of New Mexico, Acoma Pueblo of New Mexico, Santa Ana Pueblo of New Mexico, Tesuque Pueblo of New Mexico, the All Pueblo Council of New Mexico, all 19 pueblos, including our production with them of a 20-volume work on the history of their water rights, largely handled by Winston Erickson, who is in the audience, the U.S. Department of Education, 3 grants, the Union Carbide Corporation for help with the history of the uranium industry of Utah, and a list included in your program, and at least 30 more. If you don't think raising money is part of it, forget it. The hardest job I had wasn't with graduate students. I just bitched at them most loudly. My toughest job was raising money. Thank you to A. Russell Mortensen, Gregory Crampton, who founded the center. To my fellow directors, S. Lyman Tyler, Patricia Albers, Daniel McCool, Matt Basso, and Greg Smoke. Some very helpful deans. William Procasi, Erwin Altman, Donna Gelfand, Robert Newman, and especially to President James C. Fletcher and Vice President Jerry Anderson, who refused to allow our center to be closed, but instead gave us an increase in funding and moved us to a new college and an administration that made us a university-wide program. President Fletcher in heaven, my gratitude forever. The second oldest of the American West Center's motley crew is Greg Thompson, without whose help there would not be a center. The funding and the liaison with the Marriott Library has been indispensable. Thank you, Greg. Thank you to nearly 150 graduate students who worked here. Well, nearly all of them worked. There were 2 or 3 I wanted to kill. But I was sure if I didn't kill them, I had earned a place in heaven for what I had endured. But if those guards at the gates of the celestial realms turn me away, I'll at least ask for a whiskey sour and a pat on the head. And thanks to the undergrads, they were simply dedicated. Thanks to the tribal leaders and the colleagues in research from 40 libraries and archives. Thank you for the chance to work with the Indian tribes. They taught me much. They made me more human, if that's possible. With the work in the field, thank you to my wife that I left alone one hell of a lot of time. Thank you to those who trusted us, and thank you to those who come. Goodbye.
Thank you, Dr. O'Neill. A comment, as you listen to those speak today, there is a thread that goes through it that is most remarkable, and that is not that Floyd just provided employment or taught, but that he took you along on all of the experiences and made sure you were part of it. It was one of the most important pieces, certainly for myself, of growing into the world of public history and history. And I notice everybody that's spoken today makes a comment to that. That is a wonderful trait. Thank you, Floyd. And thank you.